You know what it's like being in a lunchroom. You can have a conversation with someone, but at the same time there's all this extra noise going on around you. Drum set has what I call lunchroom noise. It's where you can hear someone play, but there's all this extra noise going on. It really only happens with this instrument. A trumpet, when you stop putting air through the horn, it stops. That's it. Why should you get rid of this? First thing is because it really teaches kids terrible technique. They'll be playing something and when they screw up, they can't really tell. A lot of times it causes them to get off from the band because the drum set gets so overwhelming with all these overtones and undertones, whatever, they lose track of where they're at. And one of the most important things is the noise fatigue that you as a director endure every day. If you can cut that out, it's going to save you a lot of sanity. And I'm serious about that. I did my wife's maternity leave this past year, discovered for the first time how hard that was because I had kids playing. It was so loud, gave me a huge massive headache, and it caused me to kind of be in a crappy attitude the rest of the day. And I think a lot of people can understand where I'm coming from on that basis. So I'm going to break this down into two parts. The first is going to be just the tuning of the instruments, adjustments you can make on the physical instrument. Once you fix the drum set itself, it's going to help you as a director correct them on technique and a lot of other things because you know it's not the drum set's fault. You know it's their fault, which is a good problem to have, right? The second is going to be what your percussionist or your drummer can do to clean up their playing and to stop all that noise fatigue. We're going to start with the snare drum. One thing that I call lunchroom noise is going to be the snares rattling more than they need to. This is just an adjustment on the snare itself. You need to make sure the head is in the proper tension. You need to make sure the snares are up touching the head. This usually is caused because they're hanging a little too low, and when you hit it, it just rattles and they don't have that tension to stop when they need to. Tighten up that screw on the end and see if you can get that in the right place. If that doesn't work, you may need to actually loosen up the snare itself and pull it tighter so that you can get that to work. Another problem with snare is going to be a high tom buzz. This is when you hit the high tom and the snare itself just buzzes really, really badly. This is a problem that can't always be completely fixed, and if you want to fix it, there's some downsides to it, but I do encourage people, if they're using this particular snare only for their drum set, this might be a good thing to do. You take electrical tape and you just tape the two ends of the snare on the bottom head itself. It keeps it from buzzing. The only downside to this is that you can't turn it off, but if you're not really using that on the drum set, then you don't need to worry about it. I did that when I was younger because I never turned my snare off. Now that I play different styles, sometimes I'll play a Latin piece, I'll turn my snare off and play kind of a tom feel on the snare. But if you're not really doing that stuff, then I would say feel free to try it out and see if it works. If it helps you stay sane, that might be a really helpful thing. Now, with the snare and the toms, the excess ringing actually comes from the edge of the head. Quick way to fix that is to muffle it somehow. There's lots of different ways to muffle it. There's what they call O-rings. These are plastic rings that go around the edge of the drum. I've used those before. They are fantastic. They work great. Don't have the money for those, and you have a bunch of old drum heads lying around, you can actually make O-rings out of drum heads. A very popular choice, they have moon gels and they have drum dots. These are both like a gelatin that you put on the head. I have drum dots on my heads. Another thing I've used in the past is actually just window gels. You can get them for like $1 at Target or during the holidays they may have them. I've used those a lot because they do the same thing. I usually have to use more material on my head to do the same job, but it's really cheap and it's easy to use. Now I will say, if you have a coated head, it usually does leave a residue. You may be okay with that, you may be really annoyed with that. Those gels, a lot of times kids can't stop messing with them and people lose them like crazy, and that's why I don't totally recommend those for a school, but they do work. You can always use the duct tape and a Kleenex underneath the duct tape and start muffling it that way. I don't really like that only because it doesn't look very good. It makes a lot of the students think, in their mind, they think it's a cheap instrument and they don't really treat it with respect, in my opinion. If you're going to do that, I just say try to make it look as clean as possible. Don't let the Kleenex be sticking out the sides of the tape. Put it on the same spot on each drum so that it looks uniform. Do the best you can to make it look professional. I've seen people also do that on the bottom side of the head so that they can't like mess with it. If it looks okay, the only problem is on the bottom of the duct tape. It's that kind of gray looking thing. They see the Kleenex, doesn't look very good. But one thing that does really work well, glue dot, glue dot, glue dot, glue dot. You can get them at like Staples and everything. And I have done that before where I've taken a head, taken it off the drum, put a dot on the bottom of it, and then put the head back on. Kids can't rip it off. And that does help muffle that ringing. Now, when you get to the floor tom, there is a trick you can do, which I have started doing with my drums, which I really like, which is just putting about 6 cotton balls in the drum itself. When you hit the drum, the cotton balls fly up and then they hit the head and it kills the sound. I use it on my drums. I love them. The only thing I'm going to say is, yes, when kids see cotton balls in a drum, they're going to think,
I'm going to shove a pencil in there. Oh, I'm going to shove this in there.
And that is going to cause you a lot of problems. If you have coated heads or a black drum head, they can't see what's inside the drum. I'd say this is a great idea. Going to the bass drum, there are a lot of people who love that big open bass drum sound on the drum set. I personally am not a huge fan of that. I think in a school setting, for a director, for your mental health, I think it's better to make that sound die out a lot quicker so that you're not just getting hit with this booming sound over and over and over again. A very easy way to do that is to just put a pillow in the drum or to put a blanket in there. You don't want to fill the drum up to the top. If you put enough in there, that will keep the drum from being too resonant. The only issue I have with this is it can cause some kids to shove stuff into the drum because they see a pillow or whatever in there. If you put a porthole in the front bass drum head, you can buy them like that, or you can put one in yourself if you wanted to. Then if anybody throws something in there, someone can pull it out real easily, or you can take blanket in and out of the drum easily if you need to adjust it. Now we're moving into the cymbals. I say over and over that the hi-hat is the most important part of the drum set, and I mean that. There is a high-pitched ringing sound that can happen. This is usually because the clutch itself is over-tightened. That means that the cymbal is not able to actually move at all on the top, so when you hit it, stops, and it just gets that high-pitched ringing sound comes out. So all you need to do is loosen up that clutch a little bit. Make sure that it's not being choked. There's also a sound, and I wish there was an elegant way to put this. All I can think of is it's the bagong sound when a kid lifts their foot off the pedal. And that's when the cymbal is loose enough that it's sliding against the threading when you lift up your foot. That means it's too loose, and you need to tighten it up just a little bit to keep it from doing that sound. Now on the ride cymbal, this is really where the phrase stick definition comes into play. You'll hear drummers talk about stick definition, and what that means is how clearly you can hear the notes you're playing with your stick. A lot of times you get these big giant ride cymbals and old Zildjian cymbals from back in the day, or if you buy really large rock cymbals, you can start to play, and what happens is there's this gonginess, and I'll explain that, but there's a sound, these overtones that start ringing because the cymbal is vibrating and vibrating and vibrating. What happens is you almost can't even hear what you're playing. You just hear this, and that's what happens with these cymbals, is they get to this, I call it gonginess, that it just rings and rings, right? One cause of this can be the actual tip of the stick they're using is all frayed, and it doesn't have an actual hard surface that's connecting with the cymbal, and it's just getting this, it's not ting, ting, ting. It also, again, can just be a really large cymbal. Now, you can try to muffle these to the best of your ability. A lot of times I will muffle these cymbals. I don't particularly love the sound of them, but when I'm dealing with a really small space and there's a lot of people playing, I want to cut out that extra sound I don't need as much as possible. So I had an old, big, giant Zildjian cymbal from back in the day, and it sounds pretty decent, but it does have so much ringing that it overpowers really quickly in the small band room I was in. So I put masking tape on the bottom. I really recommend using gaffer's tape. That's really the best option, but of course it's expensive. I didn't have any. Anything that won't leave a residue. It doesn't sound perfect all the time, but it does save my ears a lot. I can really hear what the kid's actually playing, and I can tell if he's on time or if he's getting off tempo. It really does help in that way. There are some things you can do if you really don't love the sound of your ride cymbal and it is gonging, but I don't really recommend this to people who aren't comfortable with it. You can always hand hammer the cymbal if you have the right tools. The only thing about this is you can never undo what you've done. What the idea of it is, when you're hitting these divots into the cymbal, you're creating all these points where it'll kill the vibration. So you can make a cymbal drier by hammering it. I've done it before with a cheaper cymbal, and I actually like the sound better because it helped make it not sound so cheap, because a lot of cheap cymbals are really bright sounding and ring really, really high pitched. It did bring the sound down, but also made it a little trashier. It wasn't quite as clean sounding, but I do like the sound better, but I can't undo it. Do that at your own risk. Now the crash cymbals, there's not a lot you can do. If they're ringing too much, you can try to put some tape on them, but they are meant to ring. Make sure you don't over tighten your rides or your crash cymbals. If you over tighten those and they don't have any give in the cymbal, what happens is all that vibration travels throughout the cymbal, but it gets choked, and then it leaves it right up here at the bell, and what happens is you start to see cracking occur. It's more obvious with suspended cymbal because you can hear on a roll that rattling sound. That can be two things. One can be a metal washer on the bottom of the cymbal. I've put electrical tape over that or painter's tape to try to keep it from rattling. And the other thing would be is if the threads are exposed, which is causing the cymbal to rub up against it. You can do anything from putting painter's tape on there or masking tape. You can go to the hardware store and get tubing that fits that. You can get shrink tubing and do the same thing with that. Your cymbals will get damaged if you don't take care of them in that way. All right, if you've made all these changes, if you've done everything you can to make that drum set sound the best it possibly can, then we can start looking at what your drummer is doing and what their playing technique is doing that can maybe cause them to have these sounds. Basically all the drums. If you're still hearing that ringing, a lot of times that is because they are playing way too close to the edge, and the ringing comes from the edge of the drum. So if they're hitting on the edge of the drum, it's getting that pinging sound that you don't want. So it's really easy just to look and see, okay, are they playing in the center of the drum or are they playing on the edge? If you've seen my video on how to set up a drum set, that is really a big part of this. If the drums are set up in a way where a kid is sitting too far away and he's reaching to play, that can cause them to be inaccurate and to be hitting on the edge or not hitting right in the center of the drum every single time they're playing. If the toms are tilted flat and they're playing like this, they may not be hitting it accurately. These are all things to take into consideration. If they just have in general a weak tone, that's probably because they're swiping the drum and they're not playing a direct hit. It's not a good thing to do. You're not going to have a good technique. And I see people who for show kind of do this swiping technique when they're playing like a hi-hat or they're playing a ride cymbal. I wouldn't recommend young kids doing that until they really know how to master the instrument. With the bass drum, the only way they really can help their tone, if they're not sounding strong on their bass drum, play a little firmer. And there's a misconception because when you look at a bass drum pedal, there's a plate at the bottom that is called a heel plate. And so everybody thinks I'm just going to set my heel right there and then I'm going to play like this. This limits how much movement you have on your foot. If you raise your heel all the way up, you have all this movement with your foot that you can use. I never play with my heels down unless it's a really, really slow ballad or something, but I always keep my heels up on my hi-hat and my bass drum. And that's something a lot of young kids get wrong, and I understand why. It's misleading. Now we move into the cymbals. So your hi-hat, you can get that high-pitched ringing sound really badly if the kid is playing too close to the center of the cymbal. If you think about what is the sound of hi-hats, the sound of a hi-hat is actually the two cymbals going together. So when you hit it, it goes tss. That's the sound of a hi-hat, right? If they're playing in the center, they're not getting that tss sound. They're getting the high-pitched bell sound, ding, 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 ding. And then it really doesn't have a good tone to it. And so if you hear that high-pitched ringing, they need to come to the edge of the cymbal. On your hi-hat, you do want to play with the tip of the stick. If you're playing with the edge of the stick, it's a really aggressive sound. It's not very clear. And since your hi-hat is actually the part of the drum set that is helping keep time for the rest of the band, you don't want that to be too chunky or distorted sounding. You want it to be really, really clear. If you hear, again, the bagong sound, that is because they're lifting their foot all the way off the hi-hat. That should never happen. their foot should always be in contact with that pedal. I don't know if everyone would agree with me, but I'm a firm believer that you should always be doing quarter notes with your heel, because that's what helps a drummer keep in time, helps them feel the music. And I discovered when I was older and in college that when I really started to learn a new rhythm or a Latin beat or something I had never done before, once my foot started doing that on quarter notes, all of a sudden it was like I got it. It's like I instantly get the feel down and I could play confidently. Their foot should never leave the pedal, especially in jazz. They're going tss, 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 and they're going kong 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 bong bong bong. When they're playing that, it's about the sizzle. It's not, the cymbals don't come completely apart. They just lift up enough to sizzle. The ride cymbal. Now, if you keep hearing that gonginess, you have to understand that a ride cymbal, or any cymbal, has the bell and it has the edge of the cymbal, and then it's kind of in between. The bell is a really high-pitched tone, and the edge is a lower-pitched tone. And if they're playing right in the middle, or they're playing a little up to the bell too much, they're going to get that low end, they're going to get that high end. And it's a really like, sound. It's like two keys on a piano, a half step apart, going clink, 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 clink. That's what it sounds like to me as a drummer. Oh, it's just, it hurts your ears. So what they need to do is bring it down to the edge, from the bottom up to about a third of the cymbal. That's really a good spot to be playing in. If they're playing Latin or something that caused them to play on the bell, that's great, but play on the bell. Don't play in the center of the cymbal. That is not what you want. And then the last thing would be your crash cymbals. If they're playing with the tip of the stick on the crash, that's not the sound you want. The crash is, it's supposed to be intense. It's supposed to be this loud, like, yeah, sound, right? They're playing on the edge or they're playing up with the tip. It's not going to be good sound. They got to crash it with the side of their stick. That's how you get a good sound on that. I'm going to start diving into more of the stylistic things, but this is an overall, if you're hearing a kid play or the drum set's giving you a lot of fatigue, I hope that this will honestly help you mentally, physically, give you an idea of what to look for on your drummers. Kong, 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 bong, bong, bong. Kong, 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 kong.